The court's decision echoed through the city like a bell, unusual, unprecedented, almost unbelievable. Newspapers printed headlines in bold type: switched at birth, court orders joint guardianship. Commentators debated endlessly about justice, law, and love. But for the families themselves, the real battle had only just begun. The arrangement sounded fair on paper. Dmitry and Alexei would spend time in both households, free to move between them, free to decide where they wished to be. In practice, it was chaos. The first week after the ruling, Dmitry carried his suitcase across the polished floors of the Volkov apartment, his father's stern gaze following him. Marina fussed over him as though afraid he might vanish again, pressing clothes into his hands, reminding him of piano lessons and tutors. But Dmitry shook his head. "I won't take them. Not now." His voice was calm, but final. Marina's lips pressed into a thin line, and Sergei's silence burned hotter than anger. That same evening, Dmitry arrived at the Petrov home. The apartment was small, noisy with neighbors, the wallpaper peeling at the corners, yet the moment Anna wrapped her arms around him, he felt a warmth he had never known in the halls of his parents' home. Pavel clapped him on the back, his voice rough but kind. "Welcome, son." The words stunned Dmitry, lodged deep in his chest. He smiled faintly for the first time in days. Alexei, meanwhile, faced the opposite challenge. Living part-time in the Volkov household felt like stepping onto a stage where every gesture was judged. The meals were lavish but cold, the rules strict, the silence heavy. Marina tried to soften, bringing him gifts and asking about his day, but her efforts felt rehearsed, strained. Sergei regarded him with something between curiosity and ownership, as if Alexei were a rare artifact suddenly returned to his collection. One night, after a long dinner filled with silence, Alexei pushed back his chair and said, "You don't need to buy me things. You don't need to impress me. If you want to know me, just talk to me." Marina blinked, her lips parting as if the thought had never occurred to her. Sergei frowned, but for once, he didn't argue. The boys clung to each other in the midst of the storm. At school, they walked together, ignoring the stares of classmates who whispered about their story. On weekends, they escaped to the river or the courtyards, where laughter could still be found. They shared everything: anger, confusion, fleeting joys, and in that bond they found strength. But beneath the fragile peace, tension simmered. Marina resented Anna's influence, seeing Dmitry's smiles bloom more easily in the Petrov home. Anna feared the pull of wealth, watching Alexei sleep beneath chandeliers she could never give him. Sergei and Pavel barely spoke when forced into the same room, their stares heavy with distrust. The arrangement had given the boys freedom, but it had also forced the families into constant collision. Old wounds reopened, pride clashed with love, and every exchange seemed to carry the risk of shattering what little stability had been built. One evening, after a particularly tense handoff at the courthouse steps, Dmitry and Alexei sat together on a low wall, their bags at their feet. The sky burned orange with sunset, the city humming around them. "It's like they're playing tug-of-war," Alexei muttered, kicking at the ground. "And with a rope." Dmitry sighed, rubbing his forehead. "At least they're trying now. That's more than before." "Trying." Alexei gave a sharp laugh. "Feels more like competing." Dmitry looked at him, his dark eyes steady. "Then we make sure we don't become the prize. We stay what we said in court. Brothers. Always." Alexei met his gaze, and slowly, a smile broke through his frustration. "Brothers." He extended his hand, and Dmitry clasped it firmly. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the city. The world was uncertain, their families divided, the future tangled. But in that moment, they felt unshakable. Whatever trials awaited, they would face them together. The idea came from Marina, though she presented it as if it were the will of the court. A joint dinner, both families together at one table. "If this arrangement is to work," she said crisply, "then we must learn to behave like adults." The boys dreaded it, but they agreed. Perhaps, in some hidden corner of their hearts, they still hoped for peace. The Volkov apartment glittered with crystal and silver that evening. The table was set with fine porcelain, heavy cutlery, and dishes prepared by a chef. It looked less like a family meal and more like a performance. Marina welcomed Anna with a forced smile, her eyes sharp, while Sergei offered Pavel a stiff handshake that lasted a heartbeat too long. The boys sat side by side, their shoulders brushing, their eyes darting nervously between the adults. The food was beautiful, steaming and fragrant, but no one touched it at first. Conversation began stiffly. Marina complimented Anna's scarf in a tone that sounded more like mockery. Anna thanked her, her voice trembling. Sergei spoke of discipline, of the importance of proper upbringing, his gaze fixed on Alexei as if already measuring him. Pavel bristled, his hands curling into fists on the table. Finally, Pavel could not hold back. Discipline? He snapped. You think barking orders makes a father? A boy needs love, not cold commands. Sergei's eyes narrowed. A boy needs strength. A man does not grow soft on lullabies and soup. Strength. Pavel's voice rose, his chair scraping against the floor as he leaned forward. You mean fear? You've smothered Dmitri so long he barely knows how to breathe. Don't talk to me about strength. The room went silent, the tension sharp as glass. Then Sergei stood abruptly, his hands slamming against the table, the crystal glasses rattling. Careful, Petrov. But Pavel was already on his feet, his face flushed with rage. Or what? You'll glare me into silence. You may be rich, but you're no better than me. And you'll never be more of a father than I am. The next moment came like a spark to dry kindling. Sergei shoved his chair back, stepping forward, his fist raised. Pavel met him halfway, and in a heartbeat the room exploded, the clash of bodies, the crash of a glass shattering, Marina's shriek, Anna's sob. The boys jumped up, horrified. Dmitri grabbed his father's arm, shouting, "Stop, please." Alexei pulled at Pavel's jacket, his voice breaking, "Papa, don't." But the men were locked in fury, their shouts filling the glittering apartment, their fists striking not just each other but years of pride, pain, and guilt. Finally, with the combined force of their sons pulling them apart, the fight broke. Both men stood panting, their faces flushed, their clothes disheveled. Marina clutched at Sergei's sleeve, her eyes wide with shame and anger. Anna held Pavel's arm, trembling. The boys stood between them, their chests heaving, their eyes burning with something deeper than fear, disappointment. This is what you call family. Dmitri's voice shook, but it cut through the silence. You're supposed to protect us, Alexei added, his voice raw. Not destroy each other. Neither father spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight itself. The dinner ended without another bite. The table still glittered with untouched dishes, but its shine could not hide the truth. The parents were prisoners of their pride, and their sons were the only ones trying to hold the pieces together. That night, as Dmitri and Alexei walked together down the empty street, away from the echo of broken glass and harsh voices, Dmitri whispered, "We're more grown than they are." After the disastrous dinner, where hopes of peace had shattered into shouts and fists, silence fell heavy over both homes. In the Volkov apartment, Sergei shut himself away, his face darker than the storm he carried inside. Marina drifted through the rooms like a ghost, her lips pressed thin, her eyes cold with something that looked like shame. In the Petrov home, Pavel threw himself into work, his hands rougher each day, his voice shorter. Anna moved restlessly, her tears closer to the surface than her smiles. For the boys, it was the breaking point. If the adults insisted on acting like children, then it would fall to them to show what it meant to be grown. We have to live the way we want, Dmitri said one evening as they sat by the river. The water rushed dark and quick beneath the street lamps, its surface broken by fragments of light. We can't keep waiting for them to figure it out. If we do, they'll tear us apart. Alexei stared at the current, his jaw tight. You mean leave them? I mean stop letting them decide everything for us, Dmitri answered, his voice low but firm. The court gave us freedom. Let's use it. We'll spend time in both homes, yes, but we'll build something that's ours, not theirs. A life where we aren't pawns in their fight. For a moment, Alexei said nothing. Then he nodded, slowly at first, then with conviction. You're right. We can't change who our parents are, but we can choose who we are. Brothers. Our own family. The word hung between them, strong and certain. Brothers. The following days, they began to act on it. They organized their schedules themselves, not waiting for their parents' arguments. When they stayed at the Volkovs, they demanded time with the Petrovs. When they stayed at the Petrovs, they made sure to check in with the Volkovs. They refused to be dragged into accusations, cutting through tension with calm, unshakable unity. It startled the adults. Sergei tried to protest, but Dmitri met his father's eyes and said, "If you don't respect my choice, you'll lose me completely." Marina, pale and trembling, said nothing. Pavel bristled, muttering that no court could force him to share his son, but Alexei laid a hand on his arm and said, "Papa, please, don't make me choose between you and him." Anna, with tears in her eyes, whispered only, "Do what you must, my love." And so the balance shifted, not because the parents yielded, but because the boys themselves took control. For the first time, it felt as though they were steering their own lives instead of being dragged behind others' wheels. Yet even in this fragile new peace, shadows lingered. Pride still burned in Sergei's eyes, bitterness still gnawed at Pavel's voice, fear still haunted both women. The past was not so easily silenced. But as spring spread its green across the city, Dmitry and Alexei walked together more often, in courtyards, along rivers, through streets alive with evening chatter. Their steps were steady, side by side, and each time they said it to one another, the word grew stronger. Brothers. Not by choice of adults, not by law, not by mistake. By themselves, the city never let them forget who they were. At school, whispers followed them down the halls. Classmates stared opally, some with curiosity, others with cruel amusement. Those other switched boys, they heard, the ones from the papers. Dmitry kept his head down, his silence his shield, but Alexei bristled with anger, his fists clenching until his knuckles went white. One afternoon, the whispers turned into confrontation. A group of older boys cornered them behind the gym, smirking. So, one sneered, "Which of you is the rich one, and which is the mistake?" Dmitry froze, shame flooding his chest. Alexei, however, stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "We're brothers. That's all you need to know." The older boy laughed. "Brothers? You don't even belong to the same family." Before fists could fly, a teacher appeared, scattering the group with sharp words. But the sting of the insult lingered. That evening, as they walked home together, Dmitry said quietly, "Maybe they're right. Maybe we don't belong anywhere." Alexei stopped, grabbing his arm. "Don't ever say that. We belong to each other. That's more than they'll ever understand." The words settled in Dmitry's chest like a spark against dry wood. He realized then that Alexei's fire was not recklessness, but strength, strength he himself needed. Yet the outside world would not let them be. Reporters still prowled, hungry for stories, twisting their lives into headlines. Neighbors whispered, some with pity, others with judgment. Every step forward felt watched, weighed, measured. And still, through it all, the boys held to one another. Walking side by side through hostile halls, they knew the truth. Whatever storm the world brought, they would face it together. The tension between the families had quieted, but only on the surface. Underneath, pride, resentment, and fear still simmered, ready to break through at the slightest spark. The boys sensed it in every exchange, every glance, every strange silence across the table. One Sunday, both families were forced together again, this time by the court's arrangement of joint family activities. The judge had thought it would build bridges. Instead, it only piled kindling onto old fires. They gathered in a park where children played and couples strolled along tree-lined paths. Dmitry and Alexei tried to make it normal, kicking a ball between them, laughing when it rolled too far. For a moment, it felt almost like childhood again. But on the benches nearby, their fathers watched with arms crossed, words unspoken but heavy in the air. Pavel's eyes followed every movement, as if daring Sergei to claim Alexei. Sergei, stiff and silent, carried himself with the weight of a man who believed he should not have to share anything. When the ball rolled close to them, Alexei jogged over, smiling. "Papa, Sergei Ivanovich, want to join us?" Pavel's face softened. Sergei's did not. "We are not children," he said coldly. Alexei's smile faltered, but Dmitry called out, "Maybe you should try. It's the only way you'll understand us." The remark struck Sergei like a slap. His jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed the storm might break again. But then Pavel rose, stepping closer. His voice was low, firm. "He's right. If you want to be fathers, act like it. Otherwise, you'll lose them both." The air bristled between them, a clash of wills barely contained. Marina and Anna exchanged tense glances, each ready to intervene, each too afraid to speak. Sensing the danger, Dmitry and Alexei stepped between their fathers, the ball clutched in Alexei's hands. Dmitry's eyes were steady, his voice calm but sharp. "Not this time. We won't let you fight. If you care about us at all, prove it, not with fists, but with patience." For once, silence followed. Sergei's glare lingered, Pavel's fists unclenched, and slowly the storm passed, not gone, only waiting. The boys returned to their game, the laughter between them brighter, louder, a shield against the shadows at the edge of their lives. Weeks passed, and for the first time, the storms grew less frequent. The court's rulings still forced the families into contact, but the boys had found their rhythm: school, weekends, shared visits. And though the adults remained brittle, cracks of change began to appear. It happened on a rainy Saturday. The families had been scheduled to meet at the community hall for a joint counseling session. None of the adults wanted to be there, but the boys insisted. The hall was drafty, the windows streaked with rain, the smell of wet coats heavy in the air. At first, it was the same as always. Marina criticized Anna's softness. Anna snapped back about Marina's coldness. Sergei and Pavel sat like statues, their silence a louder argument than words. Dmitri and Alexei exchanged weary glances, already bracing for the eruption. But then the counselor, a grey-haired woman with sharp eyes, asked a simple question. When was the last time any of you truly looked at these boys? Not as symbols, not as property, but as themselves. The question sliced through the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Anna looked at Dmitri. He sat with his hands folded, his dark eyes wary, his posture tense as though expecting scolding. Something in her heart twisted. At the same time, Marina's gaze shifted to Alexei. He leaned back in his chair, restless, his hair falling into his eyes, but his smile was bright when Dmitri nudged him. For the first time, Marina saw not a rival's child, but a boy full of life, energy, and stubborn joy. Silence filled the hall. Then Dmitri, almost in a whisper, said, "All we've ever wanted was for you to stop fighting, to see us, to love us." Alexei added, his voice steady, "We're brothers. If you can't accept that, you'll lose us both." Something shifted then. Not a miracle, not full forgiveness, but a crack in the wall. Sergei's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Pavel exhaled a breath that trembled at the edges. Marina lowered her eyes. Anna reached for Dmitri's hand. For the first time, no one shouted. The rain tapped gently against the windows, the sound steady, almost soothing. In the silence, a fragile understanding began to take root, delicate, uncertain, but alive. The fragile truce inside the families was soon tested by the outside world. What the parents could not control, the city eagerly consumed. The story of the boys switched at birth, torn between two families, had never left the headlines. And now, journalists were hungry for more. It started with whispers at school. Classmates passed around a tabloid that featured Dmitri and Alexei on the cover, a grainy photo from the courthouse steps. The headline screamed, "Brothers or strangers? The battle continues." Inside, there were half-truths, invented quotes, even cruel speculation about the boy's future. Dmitri's face burned with shame when he saw it. Alexei snatched the paper away and ripped it in half, but the laughter of their peers stung worse than any words. "Hey, which parents are you with today?" One boy jeered. "Do you switch every weekend, like a game?" Alexei lunged forward, fists clenched, but Dmitri caught his arm. "Don't. That's what they want." His voice trembled, but his grip was firm. That evening, the boys met by the river, their refuge. The water was restless, the wind sharp. Dmitri sat with his arms wrapped around his knees. "It's never going to stop, is it? They'll always stare, always talk." Alexei dropped beside him, his expression fierce. "Let them. They don't know what it's like. They don't know us." He turned, meeting Dmitri's eyes. "We're brothers." That's the only headline that matters. The words steadied Dmitri, though the ache in his chest remained. He realized then that the outside world would never let them live quietly, not entirely. Their story had escaped them, and now it belonged to everyone. But their bond that belonged only to them, the storm outside the family's walls grew louder. What began as whispers in schools and markets soon swelled into constant noise. Journalists loitered near the Volkov apartment building, cameras flashing whenever Marina or Sergei appeared. In the Petrov neighborhood, neighbors gossiped openly in stairwells and courtyards, their voices sharp and curious. Imagine raising a child all those years, only to find out he wasn't yours. And what about the rich ones? You think they'll just give up their blood? Those poor boys caught between worlds. Anna tried to ignore it, carrying her groceries with her head lowered, but every step was heavy with glances and murmurs. Pavel barked at strangers who dared to speak too loudly, his temper flaring hotter each day. Let them live, he shouted once in the courtyard, his fists clenched. But the whispers only followed them home. For Marina, the humiliation cut deeper than anger. She was used to respect, to polished smiles and lowered voices. Now, reporters chased her down the street, thrusting microphones at her face, demanding, "Do you feel like a real mother?" The question stung more than she would ever admit. Sergei responded with fury. He threatened lawsuits, slammed doors on journalists, ordered building security to clear the entrances. But even his power could not smother curiosity. The story had grown too large, too bright to be hidden. The boys felt it most acutely when they tried to move freely. Every walk, every laugh, every shared glance became fodder for gossip. Once at a cafe, a stranger snapped a photo of them and whispered, "The brothers." Alexei wanted to confront him, but Dmitry pulled him away. "We can't fight the whole city," he murmured. At home that night, Dmitry stared out the window, the lights of the city flickering. "It's like we're living in a glass cage," he said quietly. Alexei leaned against the wall, arms crossed, defiant even in exhaustion. "Then let's stop hiding. If they want to watch, let them. We'll show them who we are, not victims, not prizes. Just us." For a moment, Dmitry said nothing. Then he turned, a faint but steady smile crossing his face. "Together." Alexei nodded. "Always." The decision was silent, but it was real. They would not let the weight of strangers decide their story. The pressure to speak finally became unbearable. Journalists hounded their families, classmates whispered behind their backs, and even teachers tiptoed around them as if they were fragile glass. Dmitry and Alexei realized that as long as they stayed silent, others would keep writing their story for them. The chance came unexpectedly. Their school director called them into his office one morning. His desk was stacked with newspapers, all blaring headlines about the switched boys. He sighed heavily, adjusting his glasses. "You can't hide from this forever," he said gently. "But maybe you can control it. A local television station wants to interview you both. It could be a chance to tell the truth in your own words." The boys exchanged a glance. Dmitry's stomach tightened. The thought of cameras, of strangers dissecting his every word, terrified him. But Alexei's eyes blazed with determination. "Well, do it," he said. Dmitry hesitated, then nodded. The studio lights were blinding. They sat side by side in stiff chairs, microphones clipped to their shirts, the cameras rolling. The interviewer smiled too brightly, her questions carefully rehearsed. "How did you feel when you discovered the truth? Do you resent your parents for the mistake? Do you ever wish you could go back to the lives you had before?" Dmitry's voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke. "We were angry, yes. Confused. But none of this was our choice. And none of it was our fault." Alexei leaned forward, his words sharp, clear. "People talk about blood, about money, about mistakes. But for us, it's simple. We're brothers. That's not up for debate. We're not trophies. We're not victims. We're just two boys trying to live our lives together." The studio fell silent for a beat. Even the interviewer, usually so quick with her next question, blinked in surprise. By the time the segment aired, the boys' words spread across the city. Some mocked, some criticized, but many more nodded in respect. For once, their story was told not by newspapers, not by whispers, but by their own voices. That night, back at the river, Dmitry smiled faintly, a rare light in his eyes. "We did it. We spoke for ourselves." Alexei grinned, tossing a stone into the water. "And next time, we'll speak louder." The interview aired on a Thursday evening, right after the news. Most of the city had already settled into dinner, the smell of food rising through stairwells and courtyards when the boys' faces appeared on screens across the city. Their voices, trembling at first but growing stronger, filled living rooms, kitchens, and cafes. In the Petrov apartment, Anna sat on the worn couch, her hands clasped tight in her lap. When Alexei's words came, "We're brothers. That's not up for debate." Tears spilled down her cheeks. Pavel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his jaw working. At first he muttered something about journalists feeding off children, but as Dmitry's quiet strength echoed from the screen, Pavel's face softened. He turned away so Anna wouldn't see the shine in his eyes. Across the city, in the Volkov apartment, the atmosphere was colder. Marina sat rigidly in an armchair, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They shouldn't have gone public," she whispered. "They're children. They don't know what they're doing." But her voice wavered, betraying the tremor in her chest. Sergei, standing behind her, watched in silence. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes lingered on Dmitry longer than usual. When the boy on the screen said, "We're not trophies. We're just two boys trying to live our lives together," Sergei's hand tightened on the back of the chair. He said nothing, but for once, no rebuke came. The next day, the reaction spread. Teachers approached the boys in the halls with cautious nods of respect. Some classmates mocked them still, but others, unexpectedly, clapped them on the shoulder or whispered, "Good for you." Even strangers on the street gave them looks that weren't only curious, but sometimes kind. That evening, when the boys met at the river as always, Dmitry asked quietly, "Do you think it mattered?" Alexei smirked, skipping a stone across the water. "Of course it did. You saw their faces. They finally had to hear us." Dmitry thought of Sergei's silence, of Marina's trembling voice, of Pavel's hidden tears and Anna's open ones. For the first time, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, their families could learn. The interview changed something, though no one admitted it at first. The words of the boys hung in the air of both households, echoing long after the television went dark. For once, the families were forced to see not each other, but the two young men at the center of it all. A week later, Anna made the first move. She called Marina, her voice trembling but steady. "The boys are asking for it," she said. "They want us all to meet again. Not for the court, not for appearances, just to talk." Marina hesitated, the silence on the other end long and heavy. Finally, she answered, "Very well." They chose neutral ground, not the grand Volkov apartment, not the cramped Petrov kitchen, but a quiet cafe at the edge of the city. The place smelled of coffee and warm bread, its windows fogged from the spring rain. The boys arrived first, sitting together at a table near the back, nervous but hopeful. When their parents entered, the air shifted. Marina in her tailored coat, Anna in her simple scarf, Sergei with his stiff shoulders, Pavel with his broad, tired stance. For a moment it seemed impossible that they could sit at the same table without the weight of old wounds crushing them. But they did. The first minutes were brittle, filled with the clinking of cups and the scrape of chairs. Then Dmitry spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We're here because we need you to listen. Not to fight, just to listen." Alexei nodded, adding, "We can't build a life while you keep tearing each other down. If you love us, even a little, prove it by trying." The parents sat in silence. Then Anna spoke softly, her eyes on Dmitry. "You are part of us, no matter what." Marina swallowed hard, her gaze shifting to Alexei. "And you have strength, more than I ever imagined." Perhaps I judged too harshly. Pavel and Sergei exchanged a long, tense glance. For once, neither raised his voice. Instead, Pavel muttered, "Maybe we've done enough damage already." Sergei said nothing, but he didn't look away. It wasn't peace, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something new, the first fragile step toward understanding. As the rain tapped softly against the windows, Dmitry and Alexei exchanged a look. For the first time, they didn't feel like ropes in a tug of war. They felt like bridges, pulling to broken worlds closer, inch by inch. It happened suddenly, without warning. Dmitry had been at the Petrovs' apartment for the weekend. The small home was filled with warmth, Anna humming softly as she cooked, Pavel repairing a squeaky chair, Alexei joking as he tried to balance a soccer ball on his head. It felt ordinary, almost peaceful. But that night, Dmitry's head began to ache. His vision blurred, his skin turned pale, and by morning he could barely stand. Anna rushed to his side, panic flooding her voice. "He's burning up. We need a doctor." The hospital admitted him quickly. The waiting room was harshly lit, the air heavy with disinfectant. Anna clutched Alexei's hand as Pavel paced, muttering prayers under his breath. When Sergei and Marina arrived, their presence filled the space like a storm. Marina rushed forward, her voice trembling. "What happened to him?" Sergei demanded answers from the doctors as if commanding soldiers. For once, both families were united in fear. The diagnosis came swiftly. Pneumonia, severe but treatable. The doctor explained that Dmitry would need close care, patience, and calm. Yet as the news settled, the parents' old patterns threatened to rise again. Blame, accusations, arguments. But this time, Alexei stopped them. His voice cut through the chaos, sharp with fury. "Enough. He needs us. Not your fighting. Not your pride, us." The words froze them. For the first time, Sergei's hand trembled as he reached for the wall to steady himself. Marina sat heavily in a chair, her composure cracking. Anna moved closer, not with anger this time, but with quiet resolve. Then let's stay together until Hayes better. And so they did. For days, the families shared the same hospital corridor. They took turns sitting by Dmitri's bed, bringing water, adjusting blankets, whispering words of comfort. Sergei stayed late into the night, his eyes fixed on his son's face. Pavel fetched food and coffee for everyone, his gruff voice softer than usual. Marina smoothed Dmitri's hair with trembling hands. Anna prayed silently by the window. Through the fever and the restless sleep, Dmitri sensed it all, voices that no longer clashed, but wove together into something fragile, something almost whole. When at last his fever broke and his eyes fluttered open, the first thing he saw was Alexei, asleep in a chair beside him, his head tilted awkwardly. And behind him, both families, silent, waiting, their walls lowered for once. Dmitri's lips cracked into a faint smile. For the first time in years, he felt not torn between worlds, but surrounded by them. Recovery was slow, but it changed everything. Dmitri remained in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks, his body weak, but his spirit strangely lighter. Each day, when he opened his eyes, he saw both families around him, not shouting, not fighting, but waiting. Sometimes awkward, sometimes silent, but together. Anna often brought homemade soup in glass jars, setting it carefully on the bedside table. Marina, though at first reluctant, eventually began to help, pouring it into bowls and even feeding Dmitri when his hands trembled. The sight startled everyone, most of all herself. Pavel and Sergei shared long, tense evenings in the corridor, their voices low. At first, they exchanged only clipped sentences, but gradually the words lengthened. Once, Dmitri woke in the night to see them both sitting on the same bench outside his room, speaking quietly over cups of bitter coffee. He couldn't hear the words, but the fact that they were speaking at all filled him with warmth. Alexei never left his side. He skipped school, ignored the whispers of classmates, and slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair. When Dmitri urged him to go home, Alexei only shook his head. "Brothers don't leave," he said simply. The bond between them, already strong, deepened into something unbreakable. They laughed at silly jokes, whispered secrets in the dark, and made silent promises about the future. When Dmitri was finally discharged, both families walked with him out of the hospital. The air was sharp with early summer, the sky bright. For once, they moved not as enemies, but as something closer to a single unit, fragile but real. That evening, they gathered in the Petrovs' small kitchen, too cramped for so many people, yet filled with warmth. The boys sat together, their parents around them, the smell of bread and tea in the air. There was still distance, still wounds unhealed, but for the first time no one raised their voice. Dmitri looked around the table, his eyes tired but glowing. This is what I always wanted," he whispered. Alexei grinned, nudging him. "Careful. You're starting to sound like me." Laughter rippled through the room, uneven, uncertain, but laughter nonetheless. And in that sound, something new was born. The fragile beginning of a family that might, one day, learn to be whole. It was Alexei's idea to go outside the city. "If we stay locked in apartments, we'll never learn to breathe together," he said one evening. To everyone's surprise, Sergei agreed grudgingly, but he agreed. Marina insisted on organizing everything, Anna packed food, and Pavel arranged transport. So, on a clear Saturday morning, they set out together, both families in one van, awkwardly squeezed side by side. The ride was tense at first. Marina scrolled silently on her phone, Anna stared out the window, Sergei and Pavel sat with arms crossed. But in the back, Dmitri and Alexei whispered jokes, their laughter slowly softening the edges of the silence. They drove until the city gave way to fields and forests, where the air was crisp and the sky wide. They stopped by a meadow with tall grass, a river glinting nearby. Children from other families played soccer in the open field, their shouts carrying on the wind. For the first time, the two families sat together on blankets, sharing food. Anna's homemade pies, Marina's carefully arranged fruit, Pavel's dark bread, Sergei's bottled water, different worlds laid out side by side. At first, everyone ate quietly, but soon Alexei kicked the ball toward Dmitri, grinning. "Come on, let's play." The boys ran into the field, their laughter rising into the air. At first, the parents watched from a distance, but then, unexpectedly, Pavel stood, his broad frame moving toward the game. He joined in, his booming laugh startling even himself. Moments later, Sergei followed, stiff at first, but soon running, his shoes sinking in the grass. Marina gasped, covering her mouth in disbelief, while Anna clapped her hands, tears brimming in her eyes. The match was clumsy, chaotic, filled with laughter and shouts. Sergei and Pavel collided once, but instead of fists, they exchanged surprised smiles. Marina even rose to cheer when Dmitri scored, and Anna laughed so hard her scarf slipped from her hair. When the sun began to set, painting the meadow gold, they all sat together by the riverbank. The boys leaned against each other, exhausted but glowing. Their parents sat nearby, not friends yet, but no longer enemies. For a moment, it felt almost possible that two broken families could learn to share one story. The school announced its annual celebration, a cultural evening where students performed music, recited poetry, and presented projects. Normally, it was little more than a formality, but this year the director approached Dmitri and Alexei directly. "You've become a symbol," he said gently. "The city sees you as a story, but maybe it's time to show them you are more than that. Would you perform something together?" The boys hesitated. Dmitri, shy and uncertain, dreaded the stage. Alexei, bold and restless, grinned at the thought. "Why not?" he said. "Let's show them who we are." They decided to present a joint piece, a story told through music and words. Dmitri would play piano, something he had always done in secret, while Alexei would read a poem they wrote together about family, loss, and finding each other. The evening arrived. The auditorium buzzed with chatter, parents filling rows of chairs. Marina sat stiff in the front, Sergei beside her, his expression unreadable. Anna clutched Pavel's hand, her eyes nervous but proud. When the curtain rose, Dmitri sat at the piano, his fingers trembling above the keys. Alexei stood beside him, a folded paper in his hands. The first notes rang out soft, hesitant, but steady. Then Alexei's voice followed, strong and clear. "We were strangers in our own homes, to lives broken by mistake. But the world gave us each other, and from pieces we made something whole." The words carried through the hall, mingling with Dmitri's music. At first, the audience shifted uncomfortably, but soon the room grew silent, caught in the raw truth of the performance. When they finished, the hall erupted in applause. Some parents wiped tears, teachers nodded solemnly, even classmates who once mocked them clapped with respect. From the stage, the boys glanced at their families. Anna's face was wet with tears, Marina's lips trembled despite herself, Pavel clapped hard, Sergei gave a single nod. For once, pride, love, and understanding flickered together in the same moment. Backstage, Alexei laughed, his voice bright. "Did you see their faces?" Dmitri smiled faintly, his heart lighter. "For the first time I think they finally saw us. The night of the performance lingered in everyone's minds. For a brief moment, two families who had once been enemies shared pride in the same boys. But life, as always, refused to remain simple. It happened one late evening. Dmitri and Alexei were walking home together after studying at the library. The streets were quiet, lamps flickering weakly, the city unusually still. Suddenly, the screech of tires shattered the silence. A car sped past too close, forcing the boys to jump back onto the curb. Dmitri stumbled, nearly falling. Alexei caught him, their breaths sharp in the cold night. The car didn't stop. By the time they reached home, both families were frantic. Marina accused the Petrovs of negligence. "Why do you let them wander so late?" Pavel shot back with fury. "Why wasn't your driver there to protect them?" Voices clashed again, sharper than ever. But the real turning point came days later. The police reported that the reckless driver had been drunk and that, by chance, the boys had narrowly escaped a fatal accident. The news struck both families like a hammer. Suddenly, all arguments about blood, pride, or wealth seemed meaningless. For the first time, they faced the truth together. They could have lost everything. That night, the families gathered in the Petrovs' apartment. The space was cramped, chairs borrowed from neighbors, the air thick with silence. The boys sat side by side, listening as their parents, exhausted and shaken, spoke with voices stripped of anger. "I almost lost him once," Anna whispered, her hand trembling on the table. I can't go through that again." Marina's eyes glistened, her usual steel softened. "Nor can I. Not with either of them." Pavel leaned forward, his voice rough but steady. "Then let's stop tearing them apart. We'll ruin them before the world does." For a long moment, Sergei said nothing. His gaze rested on Dmitri, then shifted to Alexei. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low. Perhaps they were right all along. They are brothers. And maybe we must learn to be a family too. The words hung in the air, heavier than stone, brighter than fire. For the first time, it wasn't the boys forcing peace. It was the parents. Dmitri felt his throat tighten, his chest swelling with a warmth he had never known. Alexei pressed his shoulder against his, whispering, "We did it. Finally." Outside, the city moved on cars, voices, ordinary life. But inside that small apartment, something extraordinary had begun. The weeks that followed felt different, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in months, there were no lawyers, no shouting in courthouses, no newspaper headlines plastered with their faces. Instead, there were dinners sometimes at the Volkovs, sometimes at the Petrovs, often in crowded kitchens or overly formal dining rooms, but always together. At first, the meals were awkward. Marina would fuss over table settings, while Anna insisted that a chipped plate still holds food the same. Pavel cracked jokes too loudly, Sergei rolled his eyes, and silence threatened to return. But each time, the boys filled the space with laughter, telling stories from school, teasing one another, forcing the adults to listen and, slowly, to smile. One Saturday, they all went back to the meadow by the river. The boys brought a ball again, and this time, without hesitation, their fathers joined them. The game was clumsy, full of stumbles and laughter, but no fists, no shouting. Marina and Anna sat side by side on the blanket, sharing stories of the boys as children, one tale of Dmitri hiding books under his pillow, another of Alexei sneaking bread to stray dogs. To everyone's surprise, the women laughed together. The boys watched from the field, their cheeks flushed from running. "Do you see that?" Dmitri asked, breathless. Alexei grinned. "I thought he'd never hear them laugh at the same time." At school, things changed too. Classmates no longer mocked, some even envied the bond the brothers had built. Teachers spoke of them with quiet respect, pointing out their resilience, their courage. The world outside still whispered, but the noise no longer mattered. For Dmitri, the change was most profound. In the Petrovs' home, he felt warmth he had never known, Anna's gentle touch, Pavel's rough laughter. In the Volkov apartment, he began to see something new. Marina's softer eyes, Sergei's careful words, hesitant but real. He no longer felt like a stranger in either world. And for Alexei, the walls of wealth and pride no longer seemed so high. He saw Dmitri's world not as a threat, but as another piece of their shared life. He could belong in both, just as Dmitri could. They were no longer two boys trapped in a mistake. They were brothers who had turned that mistake into a story of their own making. One evening, as the families sat crowded in the Petrovs' kitchen, Alexei raised his glass of juice, his eyes bright. To family, he said simply, "For once, no one argued with the word." Years passed, and the story that once filled newspapers slowly faded from the city's memory. Other scandals, other tragedies took its place. The whispers grew quieter, the photographs yellowed in old archives. But for Dmitri and Alexei, the story never faded, it became the foundation of who they were. By the time they finished school, the brothers were inseparable. They studied together, traveled together, celebrated every victory side by side. Their parents, though still different in every way, learned to meet without shouting. Marina softened, Anna grew steadier, Sergei's silence carried less anger, Pavel's laughter less bitterness. One summer evening, the families gathered again at the meadow by the river, the place where once everything had nearly fallen apart, and later, where it had begun to mend. Children from other families ran through the grass, the air smelled of wildflowers, and the river glittered with the setting sun. Dmitri and Alexei stood at the water's edge, their reflections side by side. Dmitri, taller now, his dark eyes calm, Alexei, still restless, still bright, his grin quick and fearless. "Do you ever think about it?" Dmitri asked softly. "What if we had never found out? What if we'd stayed in the wrong lives forever?" Alexei skipped a stone across the water, watching the ripples fade. "Then we wouldn't be here. And I can't imagine being anywhere else." Behind them, their families laughed, awkwardly at times, but together. To broken halves of a story, stitched into something imperfect but real. The boys stood in silence for a moment, the wind brushing against their faces, the horizon wide and golden. Then Alexei nudged Dmitri, his smile bright. "Come on, brother. The world's waiting." And together, they walked forward, not as victims of a mistake, but as brothers who had chosen their own family, their own future. Alexei nodded, his jaw tight. Then maybe it's up to us to teach them.